Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, for Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were there to meet their daughter Judy, who was coming home from school for the holidays. It was a warm summer day, and the station was crowded with people on their way to the seaside. Trains were whistling, taxis hooting, porters rushing about shouting at one another, and altogether there was so much noise that Mr. Brown, who saw him first, had to tell his wife several times before she understood. A bear? On Paddington Station? Mrs. Brown looked at her husband in amazement. Don't be silly, Henry. There can't be. Mr. Brown adjusted his glasses. But there is, he insisted. I distinctly saw it. Over there, behind those mailbags. He was wearing a funny kind of hat. Without waiting for a reply, he caught hold of his wife's arm and pushed her through the crowd, round a trolley laden with chocolate and cups of tea, past a bookstall, and through a gap in a pile of suitcases towards the Lost Property Office. There you are, he announced triumphantly, pointing towards a dark corner. I told you so. Mrs. Brown followed the direction of his arm and dimly made out a small, furry object in the shadows. It seemed to be sitting on some kind of suitcase, and around its neck there was a label with some writing on it. The suitcase was old and battered, and on the side, in large letters, were the words, "Wanted on voyage." Mrs. Brown clutched at her husband. "Why, Henry," she exclaimed, "I believe you were right after all. It is a bear." She peered at it more closely. It seemed a very unusual kind of bear. It was brown in colour, a rather dirty brown. It was wearing a most odd-looking hat with a wide brim, just as Mr. Brown had said. From beneath the brim, two large, round eyes stared back at her. Seeing that something was expected of it, the bear stood up and politely raised his hat, revealing two black ears. "Good afternoon," it said in a small, clear voice. Good afternoon," replied Mr. Brown doubtfully. There was a moment of silence. The bear looked at them inquiringly. "Can I help you?" Mr. Brown looked rather embarrassed. Well, no, as a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you." Mrs. Brown bent down. "You're a very small bear," she said. The bear puffed out its chest. "I'm a very rare sort of bear," he replied importantly. "There aren't many of us left where I come from." "And where is that?" asked Mrs. Brown. The bear looked round carefully before replying. "Darkest Peru. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway." A stowaway?" Mr. Brown lowered his voice and looked anxiously over his shoulder. He almost expected to see a policeman standing behind him with a notebook and pencil, taking everything down. "Yes," said the bear. "I emigrated, you know." A sad expression came into its eyes. "I used to live with my Aunt Lucy in Peru, but she had to go into a home for retired bears." "You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America by yourself?" exclaimed Mrs. Brown. The bear nodded. "Aunt Lucy always said she wanted me to emigrate when I was old enough. That's why she taught me to speak English." "But whatever did you do for food?" asked Mr. Brown. "You must be starving." Bending down, the bear unlocked the suitcase with a small key, which it also had round its neck, and brought out an almost empty glass jar. "I eat marmalade," he said rather proudly. "Bears like marmalade. And I lived in a lifeboat." "What are you going to do now?" asked Mr. Brown. "You can't just sit on Paddington Station waiting for something to happen." "Oh, I shall be all right, I expect." The bear bent down to do up its case again. As he did so, Mrs. Brown caught a glimpse of the writing on the label. It said simply, "Please look after this bear. Thank you." She turned appealingly to her husband. "Oh, Henry, what shall we do? We can't just leave him here. There's no knowing what might happen to him. London's such a big place when you know where to go. Can't he come and stay with us for a few days?" Mr. Brown hesitated. "But Mary, dear, we can't take him, not just like that. After all what?" Mrs. Brown's voice had a firm note to it. She looked down at the bear. "He is rather sweet. And he'd be such company for Jonathan and Judy. Even if it's only for a little while. They'd never forgive us if they knew you'd left him here." "It all seems highly irregular," said Mr. Brown doubtfully. "I'm sure there's a law about it." He bent down. "Would you like to come and stay with us?" he asked. "That is," he added hastily, not wishing to offend the bear, "if you've nothing else planned." The bear jumped and his hat nearly fell off with excitement. "Ooh, yes, please. I should like that very much. I've nowhere to go and everyone seems in such a hurry." "Well, let's settle then," said Mrs. Brown, before her husband could change his mind. "And you can have marmalade for breakfast every morning. And, she tried hard to think of something else that bears might like. "Every morning?" The bear looked as if it could hardly believe its ears. "I only had it on special occasions at home. Marmalade's very expensive in darkest Peru." "Then you shall have it every morning starting tomorrow," continued Mrs. Brown, "and honey on Sunday." A worried expression came over the bear's face. "Will it cost very much?" he asked. "You see, I haven't very much money." "Of course not. We wouldn't dream of charging you anything. We shall expect you to be one of the family, shan't we, Henry?" Mrs. Brown looked at her husband for support. "Of course," said Mr. Brown. "By the way," he added, "if you are coming home with us, you better know our names. This is Mrs. Brown, and I'm Mr. Brown." The bear raised its hat politely, twice. "Haven't really got a name," he said, "only a Peruvian one which no one can understand." "Then we'd better give you an English one," said Mrs. Brown. "It'll make things much easier." She looked round the station for inspiration. As she spoke, an engine standing in one of the platforms gave a loud whistle and let off a cloud of steam. "I know what," she exclaimed. "We found you on Paddington Station, so that's what we'll call you. Paddington." "Paddington." The bear repeated it several times to make sure. "It sounds a very long name." "Quite distinguished," said Mr. Brown. "Yes, I like Paddington as a name. Paddington it shall be." Mrs. Brown stood up. "Good. Now, Paddington, I have to meet our daughter Judy off the train. She's coming home from school. I'm sure you must be thirsty after your long journey, so you go along to the buffet with Mr. Brown, and he'll buy you a nice cup of tea." Paddington licked his lips. "I'm very thirsty," he said. "Sea water makes you thirsty." He picked up his suitcase, pulled his hat firmly down over his head, and waved a paw politely in the direction of the buffet. "After you, Mr. Brown." Thank you, Paddington," said Mr. Brown. "Now, Henry, look after him," Mrs. Brown called. "And for goodness sake, when you get a moment, take that label off his neck. Makes him look like a parcel. I'm sure he'll get put in a luggage van or something if a porter sees him." The buffet was crowded when they entered, but Mr. Brown managed to find a table for two in a corner. By standing on a chair, Paddington could just rest his paws comfortably on the glass top. He looked around with interest while Mr. Brown went to fetch the tea. The sight of everyone eating reminded him of how hungry he felt. There was a half-eaten bun on the table, but just as he reached out a paw, a waitress came up and swept it into a pan. "You don't want that, dearie," she said, giving him a friendly pat. "You don't know where it's been." Paddington felt so empty, he didn't really mind where it had been. He was much too polite to say anything. "Well, Paddington," said Mr. Brown, as he placed two steaming cups of tea on the table and a plate piled high with cakes, "how's that to be going on with?" Paddington's eyes glistened. "It's very nice, thank you," he exclaimed, eyeing the tea doubtfully. "But it's rather hard drinking out of a cup. I usually get my head stuck, or else my hat falls in and makes it taste nasty." Mr. Brown hesitated. "And you'd better give your hat to me. I'll pour the tea into a saucer for you. It's not really done in the best circles, but I'm sure no one will mind just this once." Paddington removed his hat and laid it carefully on the table, while Mr. Brown poured out the tea. He looked hungrily at the cakes, in particular at a large cream and jam one, which Mr. Brown placed on the plate in front of him. "There you are, Paddington," he said. "I'm sorry they haven't any marmalade ones, but they were the best I could get." "I'm glad I emigrated," said Paddington, as he reached out a paw and pulled the plate nearer. "Do you think anyone would mind if I stood on the table to eat?" Before Mr. Brown could answer, he climbed up and placed his right paw firmly on the bun. It was a very large bun, the biggest and stickiest Mr. Brown had been able to find. In a matter of moments, most of the inside found its way onto Paddington's whiskers. People started to nudge each other and began staring in their direction. Mr. Brown wished he'd chosen a plain ordinary bun, but he wasn't very experienced in the ways of bears. He stirred his tea and looked out of the window, pretending he had tea with a bear on Paddington Station every day of his life. "Henry?" The sound of his wife's voice brought him back to earth with a start. "Henry, what are you doing to that poor bear? Look at him. He's covered all over with jam and cream." Mr. Brown jumped up in confusion. "He seemed rather hungry," he answered lamely. Mrs. Brown turned to her daughter. "This is what happens when I leave your father alone for 5 minutes." Judy clapped her hands excitedly. "Oh, Daddy, is he really going to stay with us?" "If he does," said Mrs. Brown, "I can see someone other than your father will have to look after him. Just look at the mess he's in." Paddington, who all this time had been too interested in his bun to worry about what was going on, suddenly became aware that people were talking about him. He looked up to see that Mrs. Brown had been joined by a little girl with laughing blue eyes and long fair hair. He jumped up, meaning to raise his hat, and in his haste slipped on a patch of strawberry jam, which somehow or other had found its way onto the glass tabletop. For a brief moment he had a dizzy impression of everything and everyone being upside down. He waved his paws wildly in the air, and then before anyone could catch him, he somersaulted backwards and landed with a splash in his saucer of tea. He jumped up even quicker and he'd sat down, because the tea was still very hot, and promptly stepped into Mr. Brown's cup. Judy threw back her head and laughed until the tears rolled down her face. "Oh, Mummy, isn't he funny?" she cried. Paddington, who didn't think it at all funny, stood for a moment with one foot on the table and the other in Mr. Brown's tea. There were large patches of white cream all over his face, and on his left ear there was a lump of strawberry jam. "You wouldn't think," said Mrs. Brown, "that anyone could get in such a state with just one bun." Mr. Brown coughed. He just caught the stern eye of a waitress on the other side of the counter. Perhaps he said, "We'd better go. I'll see if I can find a taxi." He picked up Judy's belongings and hurried outside. Paddington stepped gingerly off the table, with a last look at the sticky remains of his bun, climbed down onto the floor. Judy took one of his paws. "Come along, Paddington. We'll take you home and you can have a nice hot bath. Then you can tell me all about South America. I'm sure you must have had lots of wonderful adventures." "I have," said Paddington earnestly. "Lots. Things are always happening to me. I'm that sort of bear." When they came out of the buffet, Mr. Brown had already found a taxi, and he waved them across. The driver looked hard at Paddington, and then at the inside of his nice clean taxi. "Bears is 6pence extra," he said gruffly. "Sticky bears is 9pence. "You can't help being sticky, driver," said Mr. Brown. "He's just had a nasty accident." The driver hesitated. "All right, hop in. Mind never that comes off on me interior. Only cleaned it out this morning." The Browns trooped obediently into the taxi. Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Judy sat in the back, while Paddington stood on the tip-up seat behind the driver so that he could see out of the window. The sun was shining as they drove out of the station, and after the gloom and the noise, everything seemed bright and cheerful. As they swept past a group of people at a bus stop, Paddington waved. Several people stared, and one man raised his hat in return. It was all very friendly. After weeks of sitting alone in a lifeboat, there was so much to see. There were people and cars and big red buses everywhere. It wasn't a bit like darkest Peru. Paddington kept one eye out of the window in case he missed anything. With his other eye, he carefully examined Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Judy. Mr. Brown was fat and jolly, with a big moustache and glasses, while Mrs. Brown, who was also rather plump, looked like a larger edition of Judy. Paddington had just decided he was going to like staying with the Browns when the glass window behind the driver shot back, and a gruff voice said, "Where do you say you wanted to go?" Mr. Brown leaned forward. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens." The driver cupped his ear with one hand. "Can't hear you," he shouted. Paddington tapped him on the shoulder. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens," he repeated. The taxi driver jumped at the sound of Paddington's voice and narrowly missed hitting a bus. He looked down at his shoulder and glared. "Cream," he said bitterly, "all over me new coat." Judy giggled, and Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. Mr. Brown peered at the meter. He half expected to see a sign go up saying they had to pay another 6pence. "I beg your pardon," said Paddington. He bent forward and tried to rub the stain off with his other paw. Several bun crumbs and a smear of jam added themselves mysteriously to the taxi driver's coat. The driver gave Paddington a long, hard look. Paddington raised his hat, and the driver slammed the window shut again. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown, "we really shall have to give him a bath as soon as we get indoors. It's getting everywhere." Paddington looked thoughtful. It wasn't so much he didn't like baths. He really didn't mind being covered with jam and cream. It seemed a pity to wash it off quite so soon. But before he had time to consider the matter, the taxi stopped, and the Browns began to climb out. Paddington picked up his suitcase and followed Judy up a flight of white steps to a big green door. "Now you're going to meet Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "She looks after us. She's a bit fierce sometimes, and she grumbles a lot, but she doesn't really mean it. I'm sure you'll like her." Paddington felt his knees begin to tremble. He looked round for Mr. and Mrs. Brown, but they appeared to be having some sort of argument with the taxi driver. Behind the door, he could hear footsteps approaching. "I'm sure I shall like her, if you say so," he said, catching sight of his reflection on the brightly polished letterbox. "But will she like me?" Paddington wasn't quite sure what to expect when Mrs. Bird opened the door. He was pleasantly surprised when they were greeted by a stout, motherly lady with grey hair and a kindly twinkle in her eyes. When she saw Judy, she raised her hands above her head. "Goodness gracious, you've arrived already," she said in horror. "And me hardly finished the washing up. I suppose you'll be wanting tea." "Hello, Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "It's nice to see you again. How's the rheumatism?" "Worse than it's ever been," began Mrs. Bird. And then she stopped speaking and stared at Paddington. "Whatever have you got there?" she said. "What is it?" "It's not a what," said Judy. "It's a bear. His name's Paddington." Paddington raised his hat. "A bear," said Mrs. Bird doubtfully. "Well, he has good manners, I'll say that for him." "He's going to stay with us," announced Judy. "He's emigrated from South America, and he's all alone with nowhere to go." "Going to stay with us?" Mrs. Bird raised her arms again. "How long for?" Judy looked round mysteriously before replying. "I don't know," she said. "It depends on things." "Mercy me," exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "I wish you told me. I haven't put clean sheets in the spare room or anything." She looked down at Paddington. "Though judging by the state he's in, perhaps that's just as well." "It's all right, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington. "I think I'm going to have a bath. I had an accident with a bun." "Oh." Mrs. Bird held the door open. "Oh, well, in that case, you'd best come on in. Only mind the carpet, it's just been done." Judy took hold of Paddington's paw and squeezed. "She doesn't mind really," she whispered. "I think she rather likes you." Paddington watched the retreating figure of Mrs. Bird. "She seems a bit fierce," he said. Mrs. Bird turned. "What was that you said?" Paddington jumped. He began. "Where was it you said you'd come from? Peru?" "That's right," said Paddington. "Darkest Peru." Mrs. Bird looked thoughtful for a moment. "Then I expect you like marmalade. I'd better get some more from the grocer." "There you are. What did I tell you?" cried Judy, as the door shut behind Mrs. Bird. "She does like you." "Fancy her knowing I like marmalade," said Paddington. "Mrs. Bird knows everything about everything," said Judy. "Now, you'd better come upstairs with me and I'll show you your room. It used to be mine when I was small, and it has lots of pictures of bears around the wall, so I expect you'll feel at home." She led the way up a long flight of stairs, chattering all the time. Paddington followed closely behind, keeping carefully to the side so that he didn't have to tread on the carpet. "That's the bathroom," said Judy, "and that's my room, and that's Jonathan's. He's my brother. You'll meet him soon. And that's Mummy and Daddy's." She opened a door. "And this is going to be yours." Paddington nearly fell over with surprise when he followed her into the room. He'd never seen such a big one. There was a large bed with white sheets against one wall, and several big boxes, one with a mirror on it. Judy pulled open a drawer in one of the boxes. "This is called a chest of drawers," she said. "You'll be able to keep all your things in here." She led Paddington out of the room again and into the bathroom. "I'm going to leave you now so that you can have your bath and come down nice and clean. You'll find 2 taps, one marked hot and one marked cold. There's plenty of soap and a clean towel, and a brush so that you can scrub your back." "It sounds very complicated," said Paddington. "Can't I just sit in a puddle or something?" Judy laughed. "Somehow I don't think Mrs. Bird would approve of that. And don't forget to wash your ears, they look awfully black." "They're meant to be black," Paddington called indignantly as Judy shut the door. He climbed up onto a stool by the window and looked out. There was a large, interesting garden below, with a small pond and several trees, which looked good for climbing. Beyond the trees he could see some more houses stretching away into the distance. He decided it must be wonderful living in a house like this all the time. He stayed where he was thinking about it, until the window became steamed up. He couldn't see out any more. Then he tried writing his name on the cloudy part with his paws. He began to wish it wasn't quite so long, as he soon ran out of cloud and it was rather difficult to spell. All the same, He climbed onto the dressing table and looked at himself in the mirror. It's a very important name. I don't expect there are many bears in the world called Paddington. By the way, said Mr. Brown as Judy entered the dining room, come to think of it, where is Paddington? He's not still up in his room, is he? Judy crossed to the writing desk and began searching for some notepaper. Oh, he's all right. He's just having a bath. A bath? Mrs. Brown's face took on a worried expression. He's rather small to be having a bath all by himself. Don't fuss so, Mary, grumbled Mr. Brown, settling himself down in the armchair with a newspaper. He's probably having the time of his life. Mr. Brown was fairly near the truth when he said Paddington was probably having the time of his life. Unfortunately, it wasn't in quite the way he meant it. At that very moment, Paddington was sitting in the middle of the bathroom floor, drawing a map of South America with a tube of Mr. Brown's shaving cream. Paddington liked geography. At least he liked his sort of geography, which meant seeing strange places and new people. Before he left South America on his long journey to England, his Aunt Lucy, who was a very wise old bear, had done her best to teach him all she knew. She told him about the places he would see on the way, and she spent many long hours reading to him about the people he would meet. It had been a long journey, halfway round the world, and so Paddington's map occupied most of the bathroom floor, and also used up most of Mr. Brown's shaving cream. With the little that was left, he tried writing his new name again. He had several attempts and finally decided on Paddington. It looked most important. It wasn't until a trickle of warm water landed on his nose that he realized the bath was full and was beginning to run over the edge. With a sigh, he climbed up onto the side of the bath, closed his eyes, held his nose with one paw and jumped. The water was hot and soapy and much deeper than he'd expected. In fact, he had to stand on tiptoe even to keep his nose above the surface. It was then that he had a nasty shock. It's one thing getting into a bath. It's quite another matter getting out, especially when the water comes up to your nose and the sides are slippery and your eyes are full of soap. He couldn't even see to turn the taps off. He tried calling out, "Help!" first in quite a quiet voice, then very loudly, "Help! Help!" He waited for a few moments, but no one came. Suddenly he had an idea. What a good thing he was still wearing his hat. He took it off and began bailing out the water. There were several holes in the hat because it was a very old one that had once belonged to his uncle. But if the water didn't get much less, at least it didn't get any more. "That's funny," said Mr. Brown, jumping up from his armchair and rubbing his forehead. "I could have sworn I felt a spot of water." "Don't be silly, dear. How could you?" Mrs. Brown, busy with her knitting, didn't even bother to look up. Mr. Brown grunted and returned to his newspaper. He knew he had felt something, but there was no point in arguing. He looked suspiciously at the children, but both Jonathan and Judy were busy writing their letter. "How much does it cost to send a letter to Lima?" asked Jonathan. Judy was about to reply when another drop of water fell down from the ceiling, this time right onto the table. "Oh, gosh!" She jumped to her feet, pulling Jonathan after her. There was an ominous wet patch right over their heads and right underneath the bathroom. "Where are you going now, dear?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Oh, just upstairs to see how Paddington's getting on." Judy pushed Jonathan through the door and shut it quickly behind them. "Crikey," said Jonathan, "what's up?" "It's Paddington," cried Judy over her shoulder as she rushed up the stairs. "I think he's in trouble." She ran along the landing and banged loudly on the bathroom door. "Are you all right, Paddington?" she shouted. "May we come in?" "Help! Help!" shouted Paddington. "Please come in. I think I'm going to drown." "Oh, Paddington!" Judy leant over the side of the bath and helped Jonathan lift a dripping and very frightened Paddington onto the floor. "Oh, Paddington, thank goodness you're all right." Paddington lay on his back in a pool of water. "What a good job I had my hat," he panted. "Aunt Lucy told me never to be without it." "But why on earth didn't you pull the plug out?" asked Judy. "Oh." Paddington looked crestfallen. I never thought of that." Jonathan looked admiringly at Paddington. "Crikey," he said. "Fancy you making all this mess. Even I've never made as much mess as this." Paddington sat up and looked around. The whole of the bathroom floor was covered in a sort of white foam, where the hot water had landed on his map of South America. "It is a bit untidy," he admitted. "I don't really know how it got like that." "Untidy?" Judy lifted him to his feet and wrapped a towel around him. "Paddington, we've all got a lot of work to do before we go downstairs again. If Mrs. Bird sees this, I don't know what she'll say." "I do," exclaimed Jonathan. "She says it to me sometimes." Judy began wiping the floor with a cloth. "Now just you dry yourself quickly in case you catch cold." Paddington began rubbing himself meekly with the towel. "I must say," he remarked, looking at himself in the mirror, "I am a lot cleaner than I was. Doesn't look like me at all." Paddington did look much cleaner than when he'd first arrived at the Browns. His fur, which was really quite light in colour and not dark brown as it had been, was standing out like a new brush, except that it was soft and silky. His nose gleamed, and his ears had lost all traces of jam and cream. He was so much cleaner that when he arrived downstairs and entered the dining room some time later, everyone pretended not to recognise him. "The tradesman's entrance is at the side," said Mr. Brown from behind the paper. Mrs. Brown put down her knitting and stared at him. "I think you must have come to the wrong house," she said. "This is number 32, not 34. Even Jonathan and Judy agreed there must be some mistake. Paddington began to get quite worried, until they all burst out laughing and said how nice he looked now that he was brushed and combed and respectable. They made room for him in a small armchair by the fire, and Mrs. Bird came in with another pot of tea and a plate of hot buttered toast. "Now, Paddington," said Mr. Brown when they were settled, "suppose you tell us all about yourself and how you came to Britain." Paddington settled back in his armchair, wiped a smear of butter carefully from his whiskers, put his paws behind his head, and stretched out his toes towards the fire. He liked an audience, especially when he was warm and the world seemed such a nice place. "I was brought up in darkest Peru," he began, "by my Aunt Lucy. She's the one that lives in a home for retired bears in Lima." He closed his eyes thoughtfully. A hush fell over the room, and everyone waited expectantly. After a while, when nothing happened, they began to get restless. Mr. Brown coughed loudly. "Doesn't seem a very exciting story," he said impatiently. He reached across and poked Paddington with his pipe. "Well, I never," he said. "I do believe he's fallen asleep."